Well, hello, my name is Connor Moran. I'm the director of the Wisconsin Book Festival, and I am absolutely delighted today to welcome Carol Anderson for the young adult edition of her book, One Person, No Vote. Carol visited Wisconsin in 2018 and took part in the 4-day celebration of the Wisconsin Book Festival, and we couldn't be happier to have her back. I want to thank all of the teachers from Madison Metropolitan School District and surrounding area school districts who have brought this event to their students. I also want to thank Madison Public Library and the Madison Public Library Foundation for recognizing how essential Wisconsin Book Festival events are and their ongoing dedication to keeping them going throughout our quarantine and on into the end of 2020. So thank you to them and thank you to all of our sponsors who make these events possible. Carol, welcome, if not to Wisconsin, but to the Wisconsin Book Festival.
Thank you so much, Connor. Thank you.
Thank you for being here. I think I said it 2 years ago when you were here, but I could talk about these things all day. So I'm delighted to be the moderator. I'll try to keep it on topic. But I think that bringing this message to young people all over the country, but particularly here in Wisconsin, is so very important. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And I agree, absolutely.
That young people need to hear this message.
Absolutely.
Agreed. Well, let's jump right in. You begin your book right here in Milwaukee. I think it takes 2 sentences to start talking about Wisconsin. And we are one of those Obama to Trump states. We currently live in a red state, and voting rights have become such a fraught and passionately protected part of our identity here in Wisconsin. And for people who are either just exercising their right to vote, or maybe this will be the first election in the fall that they get to cast their vote. I guess I'm wondering, should that be as much of our identity as it has been?
It absolutely has to be part of your identity. When you begin to think about the ways that you move through a body politic, the way that you move through this nation, the way that the laws structure how you live your life, how you don't live your life, where you're able to go, where you're not able to go, how you're able to be, where you're able to live, where you're able to work, how you're able to work, how you're able to go to school, how you're able to afford to go to school, the kind of air that you breathe, the kind of water that you drink, all of those things are embedded in politics, and all of those things are therefore embedded in the right to vote. So when that right to vote is under assault, your life is under assault. That's what we have to understand. So yes, it is embedded in our identity.
I think that's so interesting the way you put that, because so often we talk about it through the lens of just one issue or whatever. A political candidate said, maybe he said it yesterday and, didn't go over very well. But to frame it that way, where even, and to see it through all of those lenses all at once is very difficult, but you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And go ahead.
No, and I said yes, and I think that that's part of why voting gets like segmented off as this discrete thing that's over there, when in fact it is central to how we're able to be in the United States. And we have to think of it that way. We have to think of it holistically as part of a larger array of human rights. And when we think of it that way, all of a sudden, we have a very different perspective about our right to vote and the necessity of voting.
Yeah, the necessity. That's great. That's a great point. So your book, One Person, No Vote, set out to tell the story, and I'm quoting here, the misunderstood story of this disappearing minority voter in the 2016 election. Why did you feel that it was essential to create a YA version of that story?
I thought it was important because we get these kinds of narratives that come through American society. And those narratives, even when they're not based on evidence, become like bedrock foundational knowledge. And so if you allow the bedrock, and I'm getting ready to mix metaphors here, if you allow the bedrock metaphors to take root, see, rock and root, then it's really hard to then uproot them so that we can get to what actually happened, so that we can make really good choices, really good policies based on evidence, not based on myth. And for me, I also see the absolute importance of young adults knowing how this nation came to be, knowing what has led to the conditions, where they're having school drills, shooter drills in schools. How does that happen? To understand why we're quarantined now. How does that happen? To understand why we have releasing or deregulation on types of environmental protections, dealing with water, dealing with methane being released in the air. How does that happen? So I wanted to, in that 2016 election, right after the 2016 election, the pundits were just saying, well, Black people just didn't show up. And, they just didn't show up. Because you know what? Barack wasn't on the ballot. And so obviously, if Black people aren't on the ballot, then Black people don't show up to vote. What?
Because they never had before. I mean, come on.
Right. I mean, it just was inane. And then there was also and they didn't show up because they just weren't feeling Hillary. And Hillary. So you had this strand of misogyny coming in. Right. And you had this strand of what I call the narrative of Black pathology, that, they just didn't show. Well, what all of these pundits missed was that this was the first election presidential election in 50 years without the protection of the Voting Rights Act. And that's huge. And when you remove those protections, what does it look like? It looks like a 7% drop in Black voter turnout in 2016.
That's a lot of votes.
That's a lot of votes.
Yeah. And was there a narrative about that leading into the election? Was there a narrative about this is the first election without the Voting Rights Act? Were people talking about it?
Unfortunately, there was only one or two journalists. One of the key ones was Ari Berman, who wrote a great book, Give Us the Ballot, right?
Yep.
And Ari Berman was on top of this, 8 Ways to Sunday, on top of it. But he was like a lone wolf crying out there in the wilderness. Everybody else was focused in on the theatrics, the performance, the fake scandals, but they weren't paying attention to what was real, which was after the Supreme Court gutted Section 4 of the Voting Rights Act in 2013. That was their pre-clearance provision, saying that for certain states and jurisdictions that had a history of discrimination in the voting, in voting laws, that they had to come before the U.S. Department of Justice before they could implement a law dealing with the right to vote. That law worked. When it really worked. When the Supreme Court gutted it, within 2 hours, for instance, Texas had implemented a racially discriminatory voter ID law. Not my language, that's the court's language, that this law was racially discriminatory within 2 hours after that Shelby County v. Holder decision. North Carolina implemented. And that court said, you have targeted African Americans with nearly surgical precision. And then, I cannot, as you say, I got to Wisconsin and Milwaukee early. Because here you had the state implementing a voter ID law that the courts went, oh, this thing is a disaster. What are you doing? And so you get the state messing around with it, shutting down polling places, shutting down Department of Motor Vehicles where people can get the ID. You have them messing with the hours when those places are open. You have them moving the locations. So the level of inconvenience, what we saw in 2016 was that there were 60,000 fewer votes cast in Wisconsin in 2016 from 2012.
Seems like that might have been important.
Right? And 68% of that drop came out of Milwaukee alone.
Wow. I mean, that makes it very real. I think your book does a great job of that. It is so well researched and uses so many either words from the legislators themselves about why they're putting these laws into place, which I think, for anyone is quite shocking, but also just lays out a steady progression of how these things have gone. I kind of want to ask you about that a little bit. Is your book is a response to and possibly a product of the current political moment, but almost immediately after the foreword, you jump back in time 150 years to Reconstruction, and you take us all the way through. And so, I think I want to know a little bit about how you made that choice. I also want to, say to some of our viewers who might be younger, who might think like, oh, maybe you tell me a little bit about what I'm living through instead of what somebody, my great somebody might have lived through. So how did you make that choice, especially in the book for young readers?
And I did that because everything has a history. And we have to understand that history, because if we treat this as this is just happening now, we don't understand the roots of it. We don't understand how this thing got framed this way, why it even looks this way in the 21st century.
Maybe it's happened before.
Yes. To understand that it's happened before, and understanding that it happened before also gives us a sense of what we need to do to mobilize, to stop it, to change it, and how we need to not do what happened after that, which is to get complacent, thinking that democracy will continue to roll on its own without the investment, without the kind of engagement of its citizenry. That the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And so we must be eternally vigilant. So I want to take us back to like the Mississippi Plan of 1890, which is like horror, because the rationale that they used, how do we get around the 15th Amendment? How do we craft laws that say we don't want Black people to vote without writing a law saying we don't want Black people to vote? Is just what
mental gymnastics right there.
Whoa. And they pulled it off. They pulled it off to the point where the U.S. Supreme Court said, okay, that doesn't violate the 15th Amendment. And so one was the poll tax that said, and again, the language is just, we want to protect the integrity of the ballot box.
So what is a poll tax?
Yeah, and so a poll tax says that we think that democracy is expensive. And so we think that it is only fair that if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a tax to make sure that our elections are able to run. So you see how it even flips the responsibility onto the individual and not to the state to run.
And about what you care about.
Yeah, this is what you care about. So, and it says that you would be willing to pay a small fee, but if you have gone through hundreds of years of slavery, of unpaid labor, then coming out of the Civil War, you get black codes, which reinstall slavery by another name. After that, you get sharecropping, which is like incredible debt slavery.
Right.
You have societally imposed poverty on a large swath of your population. To then require them to pay to vote is to have a barrier there. And so the poll tax, while it looked nominal, it actually came to 2 to 6% of the farm family's annual income in Mississippi.
Annual income.
Annual income.
Right? I don't have that right now.
Right? So imagine having to take 2 to 6% of your annual gross income.
Perfect.
To be able to vote. And the poll tax was cumulative. So if you couldn't pay it in the first year, and you couldn't pay it in the second year, and it took you 20 years to come up with it, you owe 20 years of back taxes before you could vote. The poll tax was lethal. And you
Yeah.
link that with the literacy test. This Mississippi plan had several components in it because it says if we don't get them with the poll tax, we'll get them with the literacy test. If we don't get them with the literacy test, we'll get them with the grandfather clause. If we don't get them with the grandfather clause, we'll get them with the good character clause. If we don't get them with the good character clause, we'll get them with the understanding clause. And then South Carolina.
And then we might just intimidate them. Like
right?
if they get, you know.
Right, so all of these hurdles. And when you begin to think about where we are now, we have voter ID laws, we have voter roll purges, we have closure of polling places, we have extreme partisan gerrymandering, so we get these different mechanisms. So if we don't get them with this, we'll get them with that. If we don't get them with this, we'll get them with that. It is the same structure. How do we get around the 15th Amendment without saying we don't want these folks to vote? We'll look at the data, because that's what Wisconsin did. That's what North Carolina did. That's what Texas did. We'll look at the data. Who has what kind of ID? And we'll write the laws to
favor one kind.
Yeah, to reflect on that disparity.
Right.
I mean, so what Alabama did was to say you must have a government issued photo ID, but they didn't have public housing ID as one of their acceptable government issued photo IDs. And I mean, does it get more government issued than public housing? So how?
Right. Yeah. Right.
Right. And 71% of those in public housing in Alabama are African American. And what the Legal Defense Fund recognized was that for many of them, that was the only ID they had.
Sure.
So if you ban the only ID that folks have, you are able to then shape your electorate based on those IDs. And so you have then the politicians choosing their voters instead of the voters choosing their representatives.
And I think that's a consistent theme throughout your book, whether it's all white primaries or any of the different strategies that you've just laid out. And the court seems to say you can't choose your electorate, but it takes 10, 12, 20 years for each one of these things to be overcome. And you set the book up where at least the first section, maybe 50 pages, is about this tension between the nascent voting rights of African Americans and, kind of all the way up to the civil rights era. And then you kind of place that against Jim Crow efforts and then consistent challenges to the Voting Rights Act once we get to that point.
Right.
But it generally, there's a way of reading it that is positive that says, like, well, we keep overcoming it. The court keeps coming in and saying, you can't do that, you can't do this. We recognize that, we're changing it. And then we get to this moment right at the turn of the century, and it's shocking when Bush v. Gore comes down. It's shocking that it's 20 years ago. But it just kind of seems to turn everything on its head. And so I was wondering if you could talk to me about how we kind of have those two eras. We have the historical era, we can say, and then we have this new era where these are kind of the terms, and this is the game that we're playing now. It kind of seems to come out of Bush v. Gore.
And I think one of the things that's important to understand with Bush v. Gore is that, this was the Roberts Court, the John Roberts Court. And Roberts had been an opponent of voting rights. My mother would say since heck was a pup, since for a long time. And his mentor was William Rehnquist, who would become
another Chief Justice.
Who would become Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. That was his mentor. And his mentor got his start opposing voting rights for Hispanics in Arizona, in doing voter intimidation tactics at the polls in Arizona, challenging Latino voters as they're coming up to vote. You're not registered here. You're not a registered voter. Doing voter intimidation. That's his framework. That's his basis. And so seeing what the Roberts Court has done from Bush v. Gore to Shelby County v. Holder to Citizens United, it has been an assault on voting rights. Bush v. Gore came out of the 2000 presidential election.
Mm-hmm.
because in Florida, and remember, Florida had trouble counting the ballots in 1876. That's how we,
It's a historical precedent, I see. Okay.
there's a historical precedent here, right?
Yeah.
Um, in 2000, Florida had the problem of, and whoever won the votes in Florida was going to win the Electoral College and therefore win the presidential race. And it was
Right.
between George W. Bush and Al Gore. And it was close. It was within 500 and some votes, and they're counting, they're recounting, because part of the problem is that they had these machines that had what they called hanging chads. The machines were, the voters would select. It was supposed to punch a hole punch next to the voters,
Okay.
the
Yeah.
candidate's name. Well,
Yeah.
sometimes the punch didn't go all the way through. Sometimes
It'd be like a little part of it still connected.
what they call the hanging chad.
Uh-huh.
So,
Yeah.
so
I have some friends I think I could call hanging Chad.
right. Sounds like a bad rock band, doesn't it?
Totally. Yeah. From the late 90s. Yeah.
Right. And so the machines couldn't read them. And so therefore you're getting the manual recount. Well, in the midst of this manual recount, Bush's lead is shrinking to within like 100 some votes. And so the US Supreme Court intervenes and says, stop the recount. Bush wins Florida. And so when you have, and so what you see here then is the malleability of what is supposed to be a bedrock concept for a conservative justice, which is the primacy of the state in handling these elections. But here, when it, and so while things look nonpartisan, they're not. And we have to know that. We have to know that. And so when you have the Supreme Court intervene in the recount in Florida, it meant then that the court was willing to override, overlook all kinds of evidence, willing to override their own principles and values in order to achieve a partisan win. That's what Bush v. Gore really sets up. We see this again then with Shelby County v. Holder. Shelby County v. Holder is the Supreme Court decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act. Now, why I say they did that then, so Alabama was under pre-clearance, where any changes made in that state had to go, for the voting laws, had to go before the U.S. Department of Justice. Shelby County in Alabama started annexing areas around the city of Calera. And as it started annexing these areas, it started redrawing the district maps. And there was one lone Black councilman in Calera City. By the time they annexed and redrew the maps, he was drawn out of power.
Sure.
Yeah. So
that's a tactic you see all the time. Percentage too, right? I mean, it happens a lot.
It happens a lot. But when you're under pre-clearance, you're not supposed to be drawing these districts.
Right.
Before, because what they did was they moved him to a district that 70-80% or so had voted against Obama. So when you've got this lone Black councilman now in a district that is really hostile, and I mean, when you're looking at the data, it's not just that they were against Obama, it is that
there were reasons they were against Obama.
Exactly. Yeah. And so he was voted out, of course. And so the suit goes all the way up. And what you have is you have a district that was a city that was violating the Voting Rights Act, federal law. Sure. And the US Supreme Court said, that's fine.
Wow.
Wow. And because what it said was that the racism is no longer the force that it was in America when the Voting Rights Act came through.
Interesting strategy.
In order to do that, it had to ignore that when the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized in 2000.
Just recently before that, right?
Yes, just 2006. that the Department of Justice came to Congress showing over 700 proposed changes that it had blocked because they were racially discriminatory. So if you're looking at a mountain of over seven, and not since 1965, since 1982, if you're looking at over 700 changes that are blocked, then one might think that maybe racism has not actually,
at least 700 times.
Right.
4 years. That's still a lot.
It's still alive. It has not dissipated. It's
Right.
like a zombie. It's alive. It's alive. And so, and when you think about the kind of vitriol and hatred that was heaped down on Obama as president, you know that racism is not some thing of a bygone past. But that is how the Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, wrote it up. It said that it unduly picked on the South. As if the South hadn't been doing things that required the U.S. Department of Justice to intervene. It said that it was a static law, that many of the same districts that were under pre-clearance in 1965 are still under pre-clearance in 2013. So clearly the law isn't working. Well, that's one way to read that. Another way to read that is they're still doing the stuff that requires them to be under federal law. Yeah. The Voting Rights Act had a bailout provision. It said, if for 5 years you don't discriminate against your voting rights population, you don't have to come under pre-clearance anymore.
It feels like a short window, 5 years.
5 years. I call it just don't act a fool for 5 years. Right? And
yeah, one presidential cycle and a year, and then you can go kind of right back to it. Really?
Yeah, 5 years. They couldn't do it. Only 17 places had been bailed out.
Wow.
That tells you that something is fundamentally wrong, and we saw that immediately after the Shelby County v. Holder decision.
So, okay, I mean, thank you for knowing all of this and telling people about it. But if I'm young, I mean, I'm not young, but I still feel this way. If I'm young and I hear you say William Rehnquist was preventing Latinos from voting in Arizona, and he rose up to become the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and then someone who was a law clerk for him learned that from him, and guess what? He rose up to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and despite these what seem like pretty, plain on their face, discriminatory efforts, the court can say, oh, well, we're going to throw out the recount because not everybody's vote is being counted the same way, so it's a violation of the 14th Amendment. Or, I mean, look at it's been 50 years. These, racists don't exist. If you're a young person, how would you counsel them to think, well, if I get involved now, something might be different? Because that does feel like a weight of history kind of a problem.
And it is that involvement. So that's what's so important. I mean, and that's why I have the resistance chapter in that book, right?
Sure.
Because it looks like this thing is always there, because it is. But what else is always there is the fight for justice. What is always there is the refusal to accept the subjugation, to refusal to accept second-class citizenship, refusal to accept the denial of your basic rights, the refusal to accept that it is just about me and it's not about our community. And it is that refusal that has got us this far where we can still fight. If we didn't have that fight, oh my gosh.
It'd be worse, you say.
It would be just frightening. It was, it was that push that led to the founding of the Environmental Protection Agency. It was that push that led to the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act. It was that push that had us begin to think through What does equality really mean? What does democracy really mean? What does justice really mean? Think about how we have changed our conversation on the criminal justice system and mass incarceration because
Yeah.
of that kind of engagement
Yeah.
about not
Okay.
accepting the past. That's what it means for young folk. That's what it means for
Great.
all of us. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Right.
Yeah.
Have longer to do it.
Yes.
Yeah. Right. So I'm sorry to get back to the book. You talk a lot about the elimination of the Voting Rights Act, and then you segue directly into voter ID, which, as Wisconsinites, we all know well. We experience it. We kind of try to fight against it as best we can. But one story that you tell is the story of Sean Reynolds, who lived right here in Madison. And I know there's this phrase, "all politics is local." But this one really kind of rings true when the person lives in your community. And I'm wondering if you'd kind of tell us about his experience with voter ID.
This is the Navy veteran.
Yeah.
Yes. So you imagine you have served your country. You have been in the war. You come back and you're working a 50-hour work week. So when you think about a 50-hour work week, and there's the time when you get home, you eat something, you hug your kids, and then you go to sleep. Yeah, you go to bed.
Yeah.
A 50-hour work week is just all absorbing. But he's got a valid ID from another state.
Sure.
But he has moved to Wisconsin. But his ID is valid. His face is valid. It looks like the ID, and he doesn't have time because you also have, remember I talked about, you also had the shutting down of driver's license bureau places. You had the curtailing of their hours. And
even if they're open full time, they're not open at night.
Right.
Hours a week. You don't have a lot of free time.
Exactly. And so you can see how this voter ID law then just shuts down access to the ballot box to eligible American citizens.
To veterans.
And think about it this way too. The rationale for voter ID is based on a lie. So we're using a lie to go after the voting rights of Americans. And let me talk about the lie, because that lie is so profound. We're still dealing with the lie. We still hear the lie. The lie is massive, rampant voter fraud. That we have massive, rampant voter fraud. And so it is not too much to ask for people to show an ID to prove that they are who they are, so we don't have all of this voter impersonation fraud, where we don't have all of these people coming in, putting on a different baseball cap so that they can vote over and over and over and tilt an election, to steal an election.
And Milwaukee's one of the places that gets talked about for voter fraud all the time, right?
All the time. But how many cases of voter impersonation fraud, how many charges have been brought in the state of Wisconsin?
Let's go. None.
Exactly, right?
2. I don't know.
And so Justin Levitt, a law professor out of California, he did a study. He looked at from 2000 to 2014. He counted up all of the votes in the elections in the United States. There were 1 billion votes. That's with a B, capital B, right?
That's a great number, though. I like that number.
1 billion votes.
Mm-hmm.
There were 31 cases in those 15 years out of 1 billion votes of voter impersonation fraud. 31 out of 1 billion. That's like 0.0000000.
Yeah, this isn't for math teachers, but yeah, we can open it up to them.
right. And so this is the basis of massive rampant. That's what I mean about the lie. So on the basis of this lie, what we have done then is to erect these barriers to the ballot box for eligible American citizens. And so there was a study that showed that in the 2016 election in Wisconsin, 8% of whites were blocked from voting because of the voter ID law. 8%.
That's
Over
too high.
way too high. Over 25% of African Americans were blocked because of the voter ID law.
I mean, that is unconscionable.
Unconscionable. And also, when you think about how the Electoral College swung to the Republican candidate based on 22,000 votes out of Wisconsin.
Right.
When you've had
68,000.
Right. Yeah. It just, you begin to see the impact of voter suppression.
The impact. You're right. Speaking of impact, and also speaking of local politics, another kind of tactic that you give a special section to is voter purges. So taking people off the voter rolls who are just, should be able to vote, or they are registered, they live where they live, whatever.
Right.
And a particularly spectacular version of this was Brian Kemp as Secretary of State of Georgia, which finally we're talking about where you live, not where I live.
Yeah, right.
As he ran for governor, in his role before governor, he initiated one of the most kind of extraordinary voter purge systems. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Exact match. Yeah, so we've got two things happening. Two things happening in the purges. So I'm going to first talk about exact match, which is a Georgia thing. What exact match says is that it is a way to catch voter fraud. So it matches up your voter registration with the state's information in the state's database, from the Driver's License Bureau or from the Federal Social Security Administration's database.
Okay.
And it's looking for if there are any inconsistencies. So you have to have an exact match. So if your name is Renee Jackson and you wrote your name with an accent over the E, but the database doesn't have the accent, your voter registration is kicked up into electoral limbo. You're not registered to vote.
Wow.
Right? If you write your name, if your name is Hector Garcia Marquez, and you write a hyphen between Garcia and Marquez, but the state's database doesn't have the hyphen, boom, kicked out. So let me tell you.
And those feel like things that just those are like data entry things. Like maybe it doesn't accept hyphens in their database, or maybe there wasn't a space for me to put the hyphen on the form, but there is one in the database.
Exactly. And so when he ran this program out of his office as the Secretary of State, there was a lawsuit. The judge looked at this and said, Lord, this thing is racially discriminatory, because what it does is it privileges anglicized names. So a name like Carol Anderson it's anglicized. And so I'm generally not going to be kicked out based on my name. But if my name is Garcia Marquez or
has an apostrophe in it, or
yes, exactly, or has a space between the la and the
whatever.
And so he said this is racially discriminatory. So then Brian Kemp took that judgment of racially discriminatory policy, took it to the gerrymandered Georgia state legislature and passed the exact match law.
Yeah.
Basically the same one that the court had overturned policy, and now it's law. And that is what he used in the 2018 midterm election, where he's the Secretary of State running for governor, but doesn't recuse himself, doesn't step down from managing the election process for the election he's running in for a higher office.
I mean, that also feels like something that maybe isn't called out in your book, but we see it. I mean, Katharine Graham was the same way in Bush v. Gore. She was the Secretary of State, and she ran the election campaign.
Right. The
Recusal feels like something we don't see often enough.
Exactly. I liken it to being the director of the lottery, certifying the machines, pulling the winning $1 billion ticket and go, "Ooh, look, I won."
Yeah, we have rules against that, right? You can't.
Yeah.
If you're related to someone who works at the lottery, you can't pay the lottery.
Right.
We
And so,
can't. Self-interest is self-interest.
right. So the lack of integrity and the ethical violations that are all swooped up in this. And so that 2018 gubernatorial election between Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp was so statistically close coming into October, right? And the elections are going to be in November. In October, Brian Kemp, as Secretary of State, removed 53,000 voter registrations out of the system using exact match. Fewer than 10% of those were white. 70% of those who were removed were African American.
As he's running, I mean, all the things line up. He's running against the first woman who might become, or the first African American woman who might become a governor of a state.
Yes.
History in Georgia doesn't, no. That is, I mean, it is interesting to see, though. I mean, Stacey Abrams could not be more topical right now. And if she were governor of Georgia, I bet she wouldn't be on that short list.
Well, I think, what you see there is that because she ran a campaign in every one of the counties, and we have over 150 counties. Mm-hmm. And we saw poll closures. We saw the purges. We have had millions of people removed in the last year, in 2018 alone. Brian Kemp purged over 10% of registered voters off of the rolls.
Was the margin of the victory outside 10%?
His margin of victory, he won by 55,000 votes.
Okay. Yes. Feels pretty plain on his face.
Right. I mean, so you see, and there's another purge. Let me talk about two other quick kind of purge pieces that also target key populations. One is the cross-check program. Interstate cross-check coming out of Kansas with Chris Kobach. And what that does is it says, again, we're going after voter fraud. We're going after these people who are registered in multiple states and hopping from state to state, voting, stealing elections. Now, even the framing of that sounds ridiculous, but okay. But what it says is that it plays to American sense of technological equity, that technology is equitable.
Okay.
Right. And we love technology. So we say, so what the database does is it says is matching up voter registrations across, at a certain point, there were over 30 states involved in cross-check.
Okay.
First name, last name, suffix, junior, senior, the third.
Okay.
Last four of your social security and your date of birth. And so matching up, if they see that name with that configuration registered in Kansas and that name with that configuration registered in Virginia, boom, you get kicked off of the rolls. Okay.
So if you were born the same day as a Carol Anderson who lived in Washington State, you get kicked off.
But
or your name is John Smith, or your name is.
But it's supposed to look at, right, your date of birth as to and your last four of your social. All of these things give it the sense that this thing is fair and equal, right? Because what's the likelihood that there's a Carol Anderson that has the same date of birth, that has the same last four of the social security number?
Sure. That okay. Yeah.
Except that's not how it works.
Okay.
They really don't check social security number. They don't check date of birth. They kind of sort of do first name, but Jose looks like Joseph. And they perseverate. They focus in on the last name. The problem is that in the United States, minorities are overpopulated in 85 of the 100 most common last names in the United States.
Wow, that's an amazing statistic.
Right. So that if your last name is Williams, there's almost a 90% chance that you're African. I mean, I'm sorry, Washington, there's almost a 90% chance that you're African American.
Okay.
If your last name is Kim, there's over a 90% chance that you're Asian. If your last name is Hernandez, there's over a 90% chance that you're Hispanic.
Right.
And so what has happened with Crosscheck? Crosscheck has wiped off millions off of the rolls. Whites are underrepresented by 8% in that. African Americans overrepresented by 45%. Asian Americans overrepresented by 31%. And Hispanics overrepresented by 24%.
Wow. Wow. And that has all the makings to me of a program that doesn't work.
Well, actually,
I mean, maybe it works, but I'm saying it's not doing what it's saying it's doing.
Exactly. Funny you should say that. Scholars from a consortium of Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and UPenn, University of Pennsylvania, looked at Crosscheck, went through it, and they said, oh, this thing has a 99% error rate.
Sorry. Okay.
And this is what was operating in the United States, purging people off of the rolls during key elections and purging basically minorities off of the voter rolls. These are targeted hits. But the kind of targets, just like the Mississippi Plan of 1890, when it says, we don't want Black people to vote, but how do we write it up so we can get that?
Right. We're just saying last names. We're not talking about how anybody looks.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Exactly.
So to bring it back to the book again, and not that that's not in the book, but so we've read about poll taxes and literacy tests and voter ID and voter purges and false claims of voter fraud. To kind of extrapolate out from the world of the book to the world that we all kind of interact with, how should we, as viewers, as people who read the news, be looking at these arguments that are being made about vote by mail for this year's election?
And know that, and so this is where you look at the data, and the data are clear. Although you hear the language of massive, rampant voter fraud when it comes to mail-in ballots, when you look at the states that have all mail-in elections, like Washington,
okay,
they're not finding massive, rampant voter fraud. When you're looking at Oregon, they're not finding massive, rampant voter fraud. Utah, they're not finding massive, rampant voter fraud. Colorado. So,
but what you're saying there is states that don't necessarily align all with one party.
Exactly.
Colorado's purple, Utah's red. So you are seeing it across the board. It's not just, whatever happening.
And so what you're hearing are partisan arguments because that are afraid that. So let me back up to put this into context.
Sure.
In 1980, there was a man named Paul Weyrich. See, this is why we go back in history a bit. Paul Weyrich was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation,
sure.
A conservative think tank. And he's giving a talk to Christian thought leaders. And he says, you believe in Gugu, good government. You want everybody to vote. Well, I don't want everybody to vote because, in fact, our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down.
And we just heard that in the news in the last couple of weeks from the president.
Exactly. That is the framework for voter suppression being played out. So that was Paul Weyrich in 1980. This is what we're hearing in 2020. And so the thing is, when you're in the middle of a pandemic and you're trying to balance people's right to vote with people's right to life, to health care, to health.
Yeah.
How do we do that? And so mail-in ballots looks like the way that you can protect both, particularly in the middle of a pandemic.
Yes, we
right.
lived that here.
I saw that.
You know, and I thought about what I did. I voted by absentee ballot because I was able to get out and get it early and whatever. But, I think about if I'm voting for the first time, am I likely to vote if it means I have to go and stand in line for 3 hours and wear a mask and vote at one polling place with all of Milwaukee?
Right. I mean, this is, and so this is what became, frankly, I am what I am. Where it became so heinous that the U.S. Supreme Court, in that 5-4 decision, said that if your absentee ballot isn't postmarked by April 7th, then it doesn't count. But because of the pandemic, what had happened is that Wisconsin had received up to 10 times higher a request for absentee ballots. So the state was trying to ramp
Get them
up
out.
to get them all out. And there were tens of thousands of requests that had not yet come by April 6th, the day. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's like, so you're requiring something to get postmarked that hasn't even arrived yet?
Yeah, and I mean, I think USPS is doing a great job, but like things are slow. People are sending a lot more than they've been sending. Like
exactly. Yeah. And so you see these challenges, and so the language of voter fraud is not designed to really deal with an issue of massive rampant voter fraud. It is designed to intimidate voters to keep them from voting. It is designed to put the apparatus of the state around creating additional barriers and obstacles. So you've got some states that are requiring, in the middle of a pandemic, that if you're using an absentee ballot, you got to get it notarized. Well, getting it, so you want me to leave my house, go find a notary, and as a
bank's not open, and that's where
so
often the notary is.
So you're getting the kinds of obstacles in front of obstacles to deal with a lie.
Right. It's hard to get something notarized under normal circumstances.
Right. So you can see that this becomes another, what I call bureaucratic violence. We often think of voter suppression in terms of just the kind of physical intimidation.
Sure.
The beatings that we saw in Selma, right?
I mean, and that's not to be ignored.
Not to be ignored, but when we limit it to only physical violence, then we miss all of these bureaucratic techniques that just gut our civil rights, it creates a civic death in American citizens, because now we are voiceless in terms of the way that our democracy runs.
Well, that's a great, the voiceless and maybe restoring voices is another kind of interesting topic that you touch on that has some real world effects right now as well. You talk about in your book, Governor Rick Scott basically refused to engage in the process by which Florida had set up to restore felons' voting rights, right? Yeah. Like he had some dramatically low rate of restoring felons' voting rights, even though there was a process, and you made a petition to the governor's office, and then he got to decide, and he refused often. And then in 2018, it goes to a referendum, and Floridians decide, we want felons to get their voting rights back.
Yes.
And then almost immediately after, you see the Florida legislature passes a law that says, that's fine, great. The people have spoken. We just want felons to pay their outstanding court costs before we actually give them the right to vote back, which does kind of harken back about 45 minutes to, sounds kind of like what we were talking about with the poll tax. You really want it, maybe you should pay for it. And And so that there's a case about that in federal court right now, and the judge just this week indicated, we haven't gotten a decision yet, but indicated that it's most likely going to be invalidated, that requirement, which would bring, maybe something like 300,000 felons back onto the voting rolls in time for the November election. So I'm sure you've been following that. I'd love to hear what you have seen in that, and also what do you think that might do to Florida for November?
Okay, so so I'm going to do a quick history. I'm a historian.
Yeah, great.
In 1867, yeah, I went back that far. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act that gave Black men the right to vote. In 1868, Florida passed its felony disfranchisement law that said, if you have a felony conviction, you cannot vote. Then Florida wrote a series of laws that only applied to African Americans.
Okay.
Yeah, so they criminalized Blackness. So you get a federal law saying Black men can vote. Florida says, how do we stop this thing? It was their felony disfranchisement law of 1868. Amendment 4 in the 2018 election was to overturn that 1868 law.
152 years or 150 years.
Okay, right?
Wow.
And by that time, there were over 6 million people in the United States who could not vote because of a felony, right? Felony disfranchisement.
Sure.
1.7 million of them were in Florida alone.
I'm sorry, that number was 6 million in this country and 1.7 million of them were in Florida?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Under permanent felony disfranchisement.
Wow.
40% of Black men in Florida could not vote because of felony disfranchisement.
40%.
40%. Over 20% of all African American age eligible adults could not vote because of felony disfranchisement in Florida. Now, Florida would count their heads for representation numbers in Congress, right?
Sure, yeah, and electoral votes, I'm sure.
And electoral votes, but they had no say.
Wow.
It is like the 3/5 clause where you could
count,
right?
60% is 3/5. Yeah, it is exactly
where
like
you
that.
could count the heads, but they had no say in who their representatives would be.
Wow.
So this is what we're talking about of Florida in the 21st century. And so the people stood up and said, wait a minute. We say they have paid their debt to society. And the Florida legislature looked up because the bulk of those people who had been disfranchised are Democrats. Those are Democratic voters. So, and you saw that difference with Rick Scott when he was governor in his commission where they would, they would petition. He was overwhelmingly agreeing to restore the voting rights for Republican felons. While
I didn't know that. That's
yeah,
amazing.
there's a wonderful story. I think it's in the Tampa Bay Times that went through to see who he was restoring their voting rights to. So you saw this imbalance there.
Wow.
People were just like, no, democracy. If you're like, put your ideas out before the American electorate and let the electorate choose.
Which is a talking point we hear from elected officials across the board all the time.
All the
people.
Right. And so, but when you can choose your electorate, and so this is what you're seeing. Yeah. So when you think about how close elections have been in Florida, like in the 2000,
100 votes, you said 100 votes.
Yeah, right. When you think about what it meant in, I ran the numbers in the 2016 election and looked at if those who had been disfranchised because of a felony conviction, who were out of prison but disfranchised, if they had their voting rights back, and then because there are data about what are the percentage of those who have regained their voting rights, it's not 100% of them go vote, right? But
sure,
right. that percentage and that percentage, but Hillary would have carried, excuse me, whoo, Hillary would have carried Florida if
I would have changed things.
it would have changed things. It would have changed things dramatically. So what that means in this election is huge, huge, because so many people have been disfranchised and now get to be returning citizens with their voting rights restored, that we're going to see a different dynamic in Florida. And that's why, yeah, that's why the legislature is fighting so hard to try to block these voters from the polls.
And something, I mean, honestly, something we haven't seen since the Civil War, so we've never seen it. 1868, I mean,
right?
It's a different world, right?
It's a different world. It's a different world.
So that kind of brings me, to this. This is a heavy conversation, I think, for anybody to have. You seem to have it a lot, and I thank you for that. One thing that comes out of your book is, no matter what you're talking about, what these strategies are, how dark things, there is a decidedly positive tone to your book and an outlook to your book. And even though it takes, I don't know, about 170 pages to get there, we get there, and you have this section that talks about the last Senate election in Alabama. And you begin the book talking about the disappearing minority voter.
Mm-hmm.
In the book, talking about the Black Belt of Alabama, and particularly Selma. It's like, if you saw it in a movie, you wouldn't believe it. Coming out and supporting Doug Jones and putting a Democrat in a Senate seat from Alabama. And so I guess my question is the narrative of the disappearing minority voter disappearing?
It is, in the movement, civil rights movement, they used to sing a song. They say that freedom is a mighty hard struggle. So that narrative is not disappearing. That narrative is one that is an ongoing struggle to make sure that American citizens' voices are heard at the polls. And it has taken multiple lawsuits. It has taken multiple organizing. Stacey Abrams' Fair Fight organization that is set up for voter registration, but also for identifying impediments to the right to vote coming out of legislatures and helping to mobilize to stop that. It's all of that. This when I say that, and I'm not, this isn't original, of course I'm quoting somebody, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance.
Right.
What we're
seeing, our takeaway today, I think.
Right? We're seeing that eternal vigilance, that eternal struggle. In Alabama, it wasn't just that Black folks went, ooh, Roy Moore, not feeling him, and decided to go vote.
Right.
Alabama had applied every method of voter suppression against that Black population, including poll closures, including felony disfranchisement, including voter ID and lack of access to the places where you could get the ID. Including Alabama had done it to the point where John Merrill, who was the Secretary of State, didn't consider voting a right, but a privilege. Because that's
dangerous territory.
Yeah, that's part of the language that we're hearing now, is that it's a privilege that you have to earn. So, you've got to jump through all of these hoops to eventually get to the ballot box. No. And so that incredible organizing from civil society. So what was happening on those college campuses? Students registering each other to vote, figuring out where their polling places were, organizing. The vote in, John Merrill thought that the voter turnout would be 25% in Alabama for that special election.
Of eligible voters.
Actually, It turned out to be 40%.
Wow.
In the black belt counties, though, 45%, 5 percentage points higher than the state average.
That's incredible.
That kind of organizing, mobilizing is why we don't have Senator Roy Moore.
Yeah. I mean, I think organizing, we're coming up on the end here, and so I think organizing is a good jumping off point. The cover of your book says that the book contains tips for teens to make a difference. And I really think that's one of the most powerful things about your book. What are those ways, and how do you counsel teens to start making a difference? Maybe organizing is a great place to start, but
organizing, registering to vote. I mean, that battle to lower the voting age to 18 was real. It came out of the Vietnam War, where the US was sending 18-year-olds to fight, thousands of miles away, yet they didn't have any say in the representatives who were sending them and putting their bodies on the line. And so that fight to get the 26th Amendment is real. And then that fight to get the 26th Amendment realized came out of a college campus in Texas, where the local election officials were not registering the students on that campus to vote, saying, well, you got to show your property tax slip. You're paid. Now, if you're a college student, you haven't bought property to have a property tax.
No, you're 32. You haven't.
Right. But so again, these kinds of bureaucratic maneuvers. And so that case went up in 1979, and the courts ruled that no, college students have the right to vote on their campuses. So I mean,
that's a great message to many students who are going to be, going out to college campuses.
Yeah. So registering to vote, figuring out, doing the work in terms of figuring out who are the issues and who are the candidates, what are the policies, so that you are really engaged and knowledgeable about who and what you're voting for. Volunteering. Campaigns and issues that are on the ballots, they always need folks who are willing to write letters, to call, phone, all of that. We had here in Georgia, under another massive voter roll purge.
Really?
Yes. I walked in because we were going through the list, making sure that the people who had been purged actually, were supposed to be purged, to let them in the purge list. And I walked in and I saw a slew of my students sitting there on the phone. I was
That's great. That's great.
And this is the work of democracy.
Yeah.
This is the work that we do. Registering to vote, talking to your friends about the power and the necessity of vote. Figuring out when the lies are coming down about mail ballots or massive rampant voter fraud, knowing why that's a lie. Not that just that it is a lie, but why it's a lie. So that when you hear it, you can counter it immediately. Yeah. So that kind of work, I mean, a vibrant, engaged society, citizenry, wow. When we have that, we're going to get the democracy we deserve, and not the one that's being foisted upon us.
That's excellent. I have one last question, and it's about that voting age. Many of the arguments that people will use against lowering the voting age even more, things like, you need a certain level of reasoning, or young people are very easy to coerce, and their parents might, tell them what to do. Were the same arguments that were used to try to keep women from getting the vote, to try to keep African Americans from getting the vote, and now people might use them against younger people. So should we look at lowering the voting age? Should we look at building things in place to maybe not on the federal level or on the local level?
I have thought about that. And one of the things that I have seen that I resonate with is an earlier engagement. So one of the things that we see in California, for instance, is that it has automatic voter registration. So that, when you're getting your driver's license, when you're in touch with one of the big bureaucracies, you're automatically registered to vote. But what the Secretary of State did there was he pre-registered 16 and 17-year-olds so that the kind of civic engagement and knowledge base and the expectation of engagement is built in at 16.
Yeah.
So that when they turn 18, boom, they're off and
Ready to go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And North Carolina had that, and it worked beautifully. And then came the 2010 election. And one of the first things that legislature did was to remove civic education and pre-registration from 16 to 17-year-olds. So I am all for the pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a lot of the people who are going to be watching this today. I just want to really say thank you so much. As I said at the beginning, I could do this all day. And I really think this is a special book and it's a special message. And thank you for bringing it to us.
Oh, thank you, Connor. Thank you so much. And the Wisconsin Book Festival. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to say, again, you can click the link at the bottom of the video and get your free copy of One Person, No Vote sent to you. Thank you to the estate of Cheryl Rosen Weston for providing the funds that make those books free to all of our viewers today. Carol, have a lovely day, and we'll see you the next time you have a book.
Absolutely. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.